I am delighted to say a few words introducing Gabriele Vallentin's exhibition. She's originally from Bielefeld and studied Anglistik, English literature, and textile arts at the University of Münster. And then she went on to study fine arts at the University of Bielefeld. In 2000, she earned her doctorate in Ästhetische Bildung at the University of Cologne. And during these years, she was teaching at high schools in Gütersloh and Bielefeld, and also she has taught at the Pädagogische Hochschule in Freiburg, where she lives now and worked as a freelance artist. She's also been, since 2006, I think still is president of the Federation of Women Artists and Patrons of the Arts. She has also been honored with many, many solo and also group exhibitions, not only in Germany, but also in Spain, in France, in Italy, in China, and in the United States. And in 2010, she received the European Regio-Preis für Bildende Kunst der Europäischen Kulturstiftung Pro Europa. Now, despite the many, many exhibitions she's had, I wanted to point out that the Carl-Schurz-Haus exhibition is a first in several respects. First, it's the first to bring together what I'll call Gabi's US work. Typically, the paintings have been done in Germany based on photographs or watercolors that she did on site. They're part, however, of a large body of work where depicting landscapes, cityscapes, and people from diverse, often non-European cultures around the world. I can't begin to name them all. Mauritius, Indonesia, India, etc. Very often exotic places, but she never looks at them with an Orientalist gaze. I would suggest checking out her website to get a little sense of those. Secondly, since the work here was produced over about 20 years, the exhibition is the first to offer a sense of her evolution as an artist. If I can sum that up probably in a somewhat reductive way, her work has been marked by a movement from more representational art to abstraction, from smaller paintings to large formats, always dominated by a love of color, or if I can mention a German-American filmmaker, I love Douglas Sirk, and a magnificent obsession with color. Some of her recent work are huge, huge paintings, this magnificent swaths of color that are really, it takes a bodily experience to really appreciate them. Seeing them online isn't going to do it. I do enjoy seeing photographs of a diminutive Gabi standing in front of her giant painting. Finally, the exhibition offers a unique glimpse into the process by which she works. The best example here are the Napa pictures, which are kind of in this, down that hall. You can see a series of small watercolor paintings that she did in the Napa Valley, and you're likely to at least recognize the kind of landscape there are. That on the opposite wall, you see two large oil paintings that she later painted on the basis of the watercolors that were kind of a temporary Speicher for her memory. She talked about how these things work on her as she works on them, and the intensity grows. And of course, with all of us, our memory changes things, and if it doesn't distort them, at least in some cases. In this case, two paintings emerge whose subject we wouldn't likely recognize. You're not going to see that and say, oh, this is clearly the Napa Valley, but they leave a powerful impression of color that leaves us open to all kinds of associations. At one point, Gabi mentioned she'd be interested to hear whether and how these paintings speak to me as an American. Is she seeing something in America that I can't, or am I missing something? So the very fact that we're here in the Carl-Schurz-Haus seeing paintings of America by a German artist commented on by an American raises the whole issue of cultural determination of perception, or what we academics love to call the gaze of the other. As mentioned, so Gabi and I have have shared the experience of living in another country, which I'm sure many, many people in this room have, which means enduring that gaze that turns us into the other. Something that's particularly traumatic for those of us from a hegemonic superpower who have grown up in the comfortable conviction that everybody should do things the way we do. So, do I, as an American, experience Verfremdung in Gabriele Vallentin's America? I'd have to say, as you guys do, Yein. I'm pretty sure that the last thing she aims to be is didactic or deconstructive. She is not telling me or us anything the way the Frankfurt School emigres would criticize the US culture industry, or filmmakers like Werner Herzog and Wim Wenders turn their critical gaze on our culture. The otherness, I sense, is not grounded in geography or foreignness, but in an aesthetic sensibility with which Gabi could and has recorded experiences and impressions of many different cultures. Her estranging gaze moves things to a different plane, transforms them so that they're less and more than themselves. They're familiar and unfamiliar. They are, to use a fancy word, aestheticized. I don't know if it's a kind of a stretch to say that you and I travel to places, Gabi travels to Farbräume, a word I found a lot in reading, art historical discussions of her work. At the same time, I do want to point out there's something unpretentious about her, if you can get her to tell you some of the anecdotes that provided the actual impetus for some of these paintings, like I'm snorkeling along, and I have this exchange of looks with intensely with the fish, etc. And she also tends to downplay her own agency. Sometimes it almost feels as if the objects choose her, like the fish choosing her. And she talks about her inability to anticipate what will strike her, was mir ins Auge sticht. All the greater my awe at the way Gabi does manage to take this essence home with her. Rather than souvenirs, she somehow manages to use souvenir in the French sense and develop them into something else. For no less than 2 years, she threw herself into the most Floridian of objects, shells. But how did she do that? No two shells are identical, nor are any of her shell paintings. When you come in, you'll see 8 Paare, innen und außen, displays a series of shells in exquisite detail, each pair being the same shell seen from 2 different angles, different color scales, exhibiting a play with light, with exterior and interior movement and stillness. And then right next to it is a painting that, with its abstraction and simplicity, offers a stark contrast with the meticulousness of the shells. For Gabi, as far as I know, in Usual Move, it includes a written text that I think one could see as a kind of mantra: take only memories, leave only footprints. I note that is in the imperative, so it's, I think, as close as she gets to telling us something. But again, with a certain humility, a respect for the areas, the landscapes, nature, the threatened nature in many cases. And yet another painting across the way is as crowded with shells as the previous one is empty. We see masses of shells piled up, layered over each other with gauzy transparency. The focus shifted from the originality of the original shells to their relationship and rhythm. Its title, Reste vom Leben, refers to a cycle of works she did on the theme of Hüllen, or covers. Shells are covers cast off by their occupants, remains of former life that are far more beautiful than the remnants of other animals. A bit of a stretch, but one might use the same term Hüllen to refer to the buildings in her New York and San Francisco series. Inside these structures, we can imagine exchange, business, life going on. We can see enough to recognize where and what they are. Sometimes we even recognize a particular building, but they are not and don't want to be realist depictions of the cities. Parts of the paintings are left sketchy or nicht ausgemalt, as I think Gabi put it. What's at stake is not the specific architecture, but a sensation, an optical impression of crowded urban life. The paintings are about shapes, compositions, squares and rectangles overlaid, color fields that border each other, sometimes diagonal or distorted views. Again, these paintings play with light, reflection, and shifting perspectives. For example, some of the San Francisco paintings overlook the city from above, creating what in film analysis we call a bird's eye or God's eye perspective. And now I can't resist making an association with cinema, with non-narrative cinema, specifically the work of the great Saul Bass, the graphic designer most famous for his credit sequences. If you don't know Saul Bass, but you do know Psycho, Hitchcock's Psycho, you will be familiar with his work. He brilliantly created a play between neurosis and psychosis, merely with lines, these lines that come in the credit series. My specific association is with his use of graphics to jump-start a story with a cityscape. I was looking at, especially the San Francisco paintings, and I just thought something, this reminds me of something. And then I recalled I had just tried to civilize my grandchildren, shown them Hitchcock's North by Northwest. And that the title sequence there, if you look at it on YouTube, it begins with a green screen filled with descending diagonal lines and then descending vertical lines that come together to form squares that in turn dissolve into the windows of a huge skyscraper. But the entire surface of the skyscraper is a mirror of the city teeming with movement. And it reminds me very much of, again, the reflection, the diagonals, and the intense color, although more blue here than green. Another example one could look at would be his opening credits for West Side Story, where New York City is suggested by lines, and then this incredibly intense colors he uses until the entire city, it's sort of a brief moment where the actual photographed city is superimposed over his lines. Of course, if paintings jumpstart a story, it's our own, but I do think they can act as a kind of, something like a scene set that lets your imagination run. I might be guilty of something by making this association that my students love to call overanalyzing. I've never been quite sure how you can overanalyze. You may badly analyze, but in some ways art criticism is a struggle to find a language adequate to work that by definition resists verbal analysis. A prominent tendency I found in commentary on Vallentin painting is to draw analogies to other art forms, most often, and I think most appropriately, with music. But some of these get quite imaginative, like the critic who described Gabi's work as ein kulinarisches Seherlebnis, vergleichbar mit gutem Aroma für den Gaumen. Or an occasional critic will resolve the language problem by burying her paintings in verbal excess, as one did hearing a dialogue in her painting Man Sehnsucht, Glück, Trauer, Hoffnung, and Schmerz. So pick which one works for you. You tonight are under no pressure to find the right language and are free instead merely to enjoy the paintings or to associate as wildly as you like. Before we leave language, and before I stop regaling you with language, I thought I should obey what seems to be an obligatory rule in the vernissage introduction genre that I perceived, and that is to begin or end or both with a quote from somebody smart, somebody who did find the right language. For me, the words that get the joy and color, form, and beauty in Gabi's work are not from Georg Simmel or Joseph Beuys or Goethe, but rather a fellow American, the great Californian drag queen RuPaul. He said, life is about using up the whole box of crayons. Thanks, and enjoy the...
Vielen, vielen herzlichen Dank, Frau Schulte-Sasse.